The most important piece of gear a knight in shining armor could wield was none other than his trusty sword. The Crusader Sword, commonly known as an arming sword or knightly sword, was the weapon the medieval knights used throughout the Crusades from 1095 to 1291. Straight and double-edged, it was efficient against the enemy's armor at the time, but apart from being a weapon made solely for combat, it eventually became a religious symbol. Taking a look at its design, the Crusader Sword had a simple crossguard and a short hilt. It also featured a double-edged blade that tapered to a point which was made to tear through chainmail armor. The blade was made mostly from steel, and according to sword expert Ewart Oakeshott, there are at least 13 types of medieval sword blades, but there are certain characteristics they all had in common. A Crusader sword had a double-edged blade with a blade length between 58 to 100 centimeters. The blade was also more tapering than the swords Vikings would use, which had more wide and shallow fullers down the middle. The earliest Crusader swords usually had one-handed hilts, but became gradually longer throughout time. The hilts were typically wrapped in leather without much ornamentation. The grip was around 9 centimeters long, similar to Viking swords, until later variations came with 15 centimeter grips, allowing for two-handed use. The first Crusader swords also had an oval-shaped pommel, which changed into a Brazil nut-shaped pommel by the 12th century. Later, the pommel would change again to flattened cone-shaped pommels. For Crusaders personally, they favored the wheel-shaped pommels, and knights from the Knights Templar would often decorate their pommels with religious badges or symbols, such as the Red Cross. Some pommels were even enameled, such as Peter de Ro's sword, the Duke of Brittany, which featured the symbol of his family arms. What separated the Crusader sword from earlier sword types, though, was the crossguard. It not only protected the fingers and improved the grip, but also could be used to counter enemy attacks. Because of this, it became a huge advancement for future sword models. Early crossguards were usually shaped with simple straight bars, but by the 12th century, the design would change to something more decorative and symbolic. Swords of the late Crusading period would become more curved rather than straight, and later on the rainguard would be applied, which was a leather flap that would overlap the scabbard to prevent rain from pooling inside the blade. The simple yet elegant shape of the Crusader sword was important for many reasons. It represented Christianity and the crucifixion of Jesus Christ, which would play a huge role for soldiers crusading for the glory of God during the Crusades. Some sources speak of the sword's design in terms of divine proportions. At the time, the design was considered proportions of perfection that represented the harmony of nature. The same proportions were used in architecture to create golden triangles and golden rectangles. Therefore, the sword design had both practical, symbolic, and spiritual value. When it came to wielding a sword, most swords were primarily one-handed. To make sure the weight was light enough for the warrior, the fullers were larger and the blades were more slender. Its tapered design also meant the point of balance was closer to the hilt, which was really important as a properly balanced sword felt like an extension of one's arm and was practical to wield. Later during the medieval period, two-handed longswords would be the weapon of choice, but the one-handed sword would still be used as a sidearm. From the 9th to 11th century were the first forms of Crusader swords. These swords evolved from Viking swords called Ulfbutt swords, which had more slender and tapered blades. From the 11th to 13th century were the knightly swords, which were mostly used by the Crusaders to recapture the Holy Land and the Kingdom of Jerusalem. The shape of these swords were mostly designed to represent the influence of Christianity and the Catholic Church. This specific type of sword would soon be a religious symbol for all Crusaders and would serve as a reminder of what the Crusaders were fighting for. Religious knights such as the Templars would feel a strong affinity with the sword and would put all their faith into the weapon in order to truly fight in battle. By the 14th to 15th century, the standard Crusader sword would be replaced with the two-handed longsword, but Crusader swords would still be used as a secondary weapon, which would then be called an arming sword. Overall, the Crusader sword's design made it versatile and practical with many variations that came along the way. Its elegant form captured the imagination of the people in that era and reflected their ideas on the faith and religion. It became the most influential weapon during the Crusades, and even today, the Crusader sword stays relevant thanks to Renaissance fairs and LARPing which feature the Crusader sword and reenacts its use like it did all those centuries ago. Thank you for watching this video and supporting my love for history, and I'll see you on the next one.